Chapter 5, Part 2 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. Not even the suspicion of provincial prejudice can attach to Thoreau's literary tastes. It is true that his earnest practical mind could not relish the subtleties of metaphysical works, the dullness of moral treatises, or the floweriness of romance. And he was usually averse to reading the magazines and journals of the day, the news in which he was interested being other than that which newspapers report. But he read largely and widely, nevertheless, and his discrimination never deteriorated into fastidiousness and partiality. The class of books which he most highly valued was undoubtedly the sacred scriptures, as he calls them, of the poets and philosophers of Persia and India, the Bhagavad Gita, Vishnu Sarma, Laws of Menu, Sadi, and other Bibles of the old Oriental religions. These he studied chiefly in French and German translations, which he accumulated with such zeal that he is said to have had the best library of such books in the country, and this was supplemented in 1855 by a handsome present of volumes in English, French, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, sent him by Mr. Cholmondeley, a young English friend. There are numerous citations from these ancient writings in Thoreau's own works, and so great was his reverence for them that he jealously asserted their claim to the title of scriptures in common with those of Jewish origin. When a young visitor from Harvard College informed him that he was studying the scriptures, Thoreau quickly retorted, "But which?" Thoreau's classical studies were not confined to his early years, but were fully maintained in after life. Homer, Aeschylus, Virgil, and the poets of the Greek anthology being his chief favorites. Classical learning is eulogized in both the Week and Walden as being the most heroic and tranquilizing of all branches of reading. The value of the classic languages, says Wentworth Higginson, was never better exemplified than in their influence on his training. They were real humanities to him, linking him with the great memories of the race and with high intellectual standards, so that he could never, like some of his imitators, treat literary art as a thing unmanly and trivial. I remember how that fine old classical scholar, the late John Glenn King of Salem, used to delight in Thoreau as being the only man who thoroughly loved both nature and Greek. His reading in Greek and Latin included not only the classics proper, but many old-fashioned authorities on agriculture and natural history, such as Aristotle, Aelian, Theophrastus, Cato, Varro, and Pliny. His respect for Linnaeus was, according to Channing, transcendent. He loved to study Froissart and the old-fashioned chronicles, and such voyages as those of Drake and Purchas, with any books of travel that came in his way. Among poets, the old English writers were most to his liking. He read and appreciated old ballad writers, Chaucer, Spenser, Ossian, Herbert, Cowley, Quarles, and above all others Milton, whose Lycidas was often on his lips. For the moderns he cared comparatively little, the chief exceptions being Goethe, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Ruskin, and Carlyle. He admired Ruskin, but thought him somewhat bigoted, finding in him, as he expressed it, too much about art for me and the Hottentots. For Carlyle he felt and expressed the sincerest admiration, as may be seen in the essay which he contributed to Graham's Magazine in 1847. There was another and wholly different branch of reading to which Thoreau devoted a considerable portion of his time: the records of the native Indian tribes, which he extracted with much labor and research from the histories of the Jesuit missionaries, the early New England chroniclers, and various other sources of information. Everything connected with the Indians had a strange interest and fascination for him. He noted and admired their natural instinct of woodcraft, their immobility and self-possession, and their mysterious sense of remoteness from the white man. He several times visited Maine in order to study their language and habits, and never failed to converse with the wandering parties who sometimes pitched their tents for a few weeks on the banks of the Concord River. His collection of Indian relics had been commenced while he was still a youth, for the soil of Concord, an old settlement of Indian tribes, was rich in these treasures, arrowheads, pottery, and stone implements being often turned up by the plow. Regularly every spring, when the fields had been washed bare by rains and thawing snow, would Thoreau set out to gather his crop of arrowheads, and his extraordinary keenness of sight in detecting these relics was often a cause of wonder to less observant minds. "I do not see where you find your Indian arrowheads," once remarked the companion of his walk. "Here is one," replied Thoreau on the instant, picking one up and presenting it to his astonished friend. This remarkable sympathy, on the part of one of the most advanced of modern thinkers, with the spirit of a savage and decaying race, is accounted for by Thoreau's strong natural inclination to the uncultivated and wild. He loved the sea and all desert places, preferred the wild apple to the cultured orchard, and the dreariest swamp to the most fragrant garden, and it cheered him to see the young forest pines springing up anew in the fertile cornland. The Indian, the human representative of wild life in New England, thus attracted his sympathies, just as the sympathies of George Borrow were attracted to the roaming gypsy tribes. This inclination of Thoreau to wild nature was not, as some critics have suggested, a symptom of an unhealthy temperament, but rather a method of retaining the excellent soundness of his mind. His whole life, says Lowell, was a search for the doctor. This was not the case. He went to nature not as a sickly valetudinarian seeking a cure for his ailments, but as a sane and healthy man, the secret of whose health lay in this very familiarity with the open air. Walking was a necessity of Thoreau's existence. He demanded 4 hours at least each day for sauntering at leisure over hills and woods and fields, taking short cuts when he could, and avoiding for the most part the grit and noise of the busier highroads. The old Marlborough Road, which led southwest from Concord, through a spacious tract of open country abounding in patches of scrub oak and wild apples, was one of his favorite haunts. So, too, were Walden woods and the cliffs which overhang Fairhaven, the wide bay formed by a bend of the river 2 miles south of the village. The river was much frequented by him at all seasons of the year. for in summer he made almost daily voyages in his boat, which he kept moored in Ellery Channing's riverside garden, and in winter the frozen stream offered a convenient pathway. On these expeditions Thoreau was generally unaccompanied, unless Ellery Channing or one of his few chosen friends happened to be with him. Offers of companionship were not rarely forthcoming, but these he for the most part declined with that frankness which was all his own. Would he not walk with them, some acquaintances would ask. He did not know. There was nothing so important to him as his walk. He had no walks to throw away on company. But for those who succeeded in gaining this privilege, a rare treat was assured. Here is a reminiscence of Thoreau from a private letter of G. W. Curtis. It always seems to me one of the good fortunes of my life that I knew Concord when Emerson, Hawthorne, and Thoreau were citizens there, and that I personally knew them. If in personal intercourse Thoreau sometimes seemed to be, as Hawthorne said, a cast-iron man, he was, after all, no more rigid than the oak which holds fast by its own roots whatever betides. One of my most vivid recollections of my life in Concord is that of an evening upon the shallow river with Thoreau in his boat. We lighted a huge fire of fat pine in an iron crate beyond the bow of the boat, and drifted slowly through an illuminated circle of the ever-changing aspect of the riverbed. In that house beautiful you can fancy what an interpreter he was. His powers of conversation, says another who was thus favored, were extraordinary. I remember being surprised and delighted at every step with revelations of laws and significant attributes in common things. The acuteness of his senses was marvelous. No hound could scent better, and he could hear the most faint and distant sound without even laying his ear to the ground like an Indian. As we penetrated farther and farther into the woods, he seemed to gain a certain transformation, and his face shone with a light that I had not seen in the village. The account of Thoreau's skillful and genial leadership of the Concord huckleberry parties has already been quoted, and from the same authority we have an equally charming description of how he would guide his friends to the haunts of the water lily. Footnote: Moncure Conway, Fraser, April 1866. End footnote. Upon such occasions, his resources for our entertainment were inexhaustible. He would tell stories of the Indians who once dwelt thereabouts, till the children almost looked to see a red man skulking with his arrow on shore. And every plant or flower on the bank or in the water, and every fish, turtle, frog, lizard about us, was transformed by the wand of his knowledge from the low form into which the spell of our ignorance had reduced it into a mystic beauty. One of his surprises was to thrust his hands softly into the water and as softly raise up before our astonished eyes a large bright fish, which lay as contentedly in his hand as if they were old acquaintances. This fish was probably the bream, whose nest-guarding habits are described by Thoreau in The Week. The breams are so careful of their charge that you may stand close by in the water and examine them at your leisure. I have stood over them half an hour at a time, and stroked them familiarly without frightening them, and have even taken them gently out of the water with my hand. His extraordinary sympathy with animals was one of the most singular and pleasing features in Thoreau's character. Like St. Francis, he felt a sense of love and brotherhood towards the lower races, and regarded them not as brute beasts without sensibility or soul, but as possessing the character and importance of another order of men. He protested against the conceited self-assurance with which man sets down the intelligence of animals as mere instinct, while overlooking their real wisdom and fitness of behavior. They were his townsmen and fellow creatures, whose individuality must be recognized as much as his own, and who must be treated with courtesy and gentleness. The strange influence which Thoreau was able to exercise over beasts and birds and fishes was doubtless chiefly due to the power of his humane sympathy, partly also to his habits of patient silence and watchfulness, in which he resembled the hermits of the Middle Ages. His hut at Walden was inhabited by other creatures besides himself. The birds would flit fearlessly through the room, the red squirrel raced over the roof, while moles and hares stabled in the cellar, and chickadees perched on the armfuls of wood which he carried across his threshold. Once, as he was hoeing in a garden, a sparrow alighted on his shoulder, which he regarded as a greater honor than any epaulet he could have worn. Nor was this all, for his mingled firmness and sympathy enabled him to take all sorts of liberties with the wildest of wild creatures. A story is told how a squirrel, which he had taken home for a few days in order to observe its habits, refused to be set at liberty, returning again and again to its new friend with embarrassing persistence, climbing up his knee, sitting on his hand, and at last gaining the day by hiding its head in the folds of his waistcoat, an appeal which Thoreau was not able to withstand. Thoreau was essentially a poet-naturalist, as Ellery Channing entitled him, and not a man of science. He was, indeed, an honorary member and correspondent of the Boston Natural History Society, but he declined, as a rule, to write memoirs of his experiences in this branch of study, on the ground that he could not properly detach the mere external record of observation from the inner associations with which such facts were connected in his mind. In a word, the natural history of the subject could not be separated from the poetry. His whole method, as we have seen, was different from that of the scientific anatomist. He observed, but he did not kill, making it his object to hold his bird in the affections rather than in the hand. It is said that when some Concord loafers mockingly asked Thoreau if he really did not shoot a bird when he wanted to study it, he replied, "Do you think I should shoot you if I wanted to study you?" His diaries testify to the immense diligence and keenness of his communion with nature, and his unflagging interest in the seasons and all they bring with them. He noted and recorded the habits of animals, the tracks of the fox and otter, the migrations and songs of birds, the croak of frogs and chirp of crickets, the spawning in nests of fishes, the blossoming of flowers, the fall of leaves, the height of the river, the temperature of ponds and springs, and innumerable other phenomena of outdoor life. Like all true naturalists, he loved birds, and many are the entries in his journal respecting the kinds that are native at Concord: the bobolink, the robin, the song sparrow, the whippoorwill, the catbird, and the bluebird, which, as he beautifully said of it, carries the sky on its back. He loved to be awakened in the early summer mornings by the song of birds, and nothing cheered him so much in the midst of a winter storm as a bird's chirp or whistle. The neighborhood of Concord, with its wide tracts of meadow and woodland, was a fine field for the naturalist, and Thoreau, in his characteristic love of paradox, was fond of asserting that it surpassed all other places as a center of observation, a foible for which he was gently bantered by Emerson. He talked about nature, it was wittily remarked, as if she had been born and brought up in Concord. Nequid que severis extra te concordemique was his humorous maxim. He contended that all the important plants of America were included in the flora of Massachusetts, and after reading Kane's Arctic Voyage, he expressed his conviction that most of the Arctic phenomena might be noted at Concord, an assertion which he partly substantiated by the discovery of red snow and one or two Labrador plants. He had thoughts of constructing a complete calendar for the natural phenomena of Concord, and believed that if he waked up from a trance the time of year would be as plain to him from the plants as the time of day from a dial. Of all flowers the water lily was his favorite, but there were none that he did not know and love. Even the growth of the sturdy aboriginal weeds gave him a sense of satisfaction. He often walked miles to note the condition of some rare tree or shrub, and congratulated himself that the time thus spent was more profitably laid out than in a good many social visits. On one occasion, says a friend who visited him at Concord, he mentioned the hibiscus beside the river, a rare flower in New England, and when I desired to see it, told me it would open about Monday and did not stay long. I went on Tuesday afternoon and was a day too late. The petals lay on the ground. Such were the points in Thoreau's personality which made him an object of interest and wonder from the first to his own friends and acquaintances, and afterwards to a far wider circle. We can well believe that a man gifted with such an intense and genuine individuality often found himself, as Emerson tells us, in dramatic situations, and that in any debatable matter there was no person whose judgment was awaited by his townsmen with keener expectation. As his fame spread, he gained an increasing number of admiring friends, some of whom traveled long distances to see and converse with him, in the belief that this was the man they were in search of, the man of men, who could tell them all they should do. End of Chapter 5.